Drink Georgetown Tavern Beer, your new locally brewed domestic-style lager. 4.2% alcohol. Cheap, good, local.
Welcome in. It's the Ground Puck Seahawks Podcast. We get to sit down with Tim Booth of the Seattle Times, who covers not just the Seahawks, but he covers everything over there at the Seattle Times. He thought his life was going to be easier once he switched over from the Associated Press to the Seattle Times, but I feel like he's doing just as much work. So Tim is with us, also Curtis Crabtree, who covers everything as well, but also sits down and covers the Seahawks, and that's why we have these guys on. Curtis Crabtree, of course, over there at Fox 13. All right, no game to recap, and I thought we would do this here now on the Ground Puck Seahawks Podcast, which is, of course, brought to you by Georgetown Brewery. Big thanks to Georgetown Brewery. Go check out their new fantastic domestic style lager called the Tavern Beer. You can get it at Georgetown Brewery. Only there, available in growlers. You can also get a pint there, and available in all of your local watering holes. Ask if your watering hole doesn't have it. Say, hey, can you please pour Tavern Beer from Georgetown Brewery? GeorgetownBeer.com is the website. All right. So we'll do bigger picture stuff here, right? Now we're into the offseason. We offensive coordinator search. We can get into a little bit of a draft as we kind of, the next few weeks kind of wrap up the season. Did they learn anything from what happened in the wild card round so they can look ahead now to next season? Let's just start here. Tim, and I'll go with you first. Curtis, just go right after him to answer this question. Besides offensive coordinator, because that's the most immediate thing that they need to hire right now and do now. What's the biggest question mark getting into the offseason, Tim?
That's a good question. I think you feel pretty comfortable that Geno is back in some capacity. So let's put that aside and assume that you have your quarterback in place for next season. I think at that point it's how you upgrade the offensive line end of the day, whether that's draft, whether you are deciding to go into the free agent pool and try and figure something out that way. I think the number one thing is how you try and upgrade that unit, because look at, defensively, as long as you come to some sort of resolution with Ernest Jones, you're kind of in some ways set over there. Like you don't have a whole lot of question marks on the defensive side. Skill position wise, I mean, obviously there's the question about DK and what the future is with him. And then obviously our expectation that Tyler is not coming back, at least on the deal that he's currently on. So other than those couple of things, I think that the most glaring thing is offensive line, as long as you are planning to bring Geno back and have him be your starting quarterback.
And I'll say it's the DK discussion and decision. Just because the top of the wide receiver market is north of $30 million a season right now. There's about 5 or 6 guys that are there at that part of the contract spectrum, and that's where DK Metcalf is almost certainly going to want to be. And his stats given over 6 seasons has proven that he probably deserves to be in that conversation. So you need to figure out if that's something you are okay with handling over the next long term here, when you consider that Jackson Smith and Jigba is also going to eventually be up for a contract within the next couple of years as well. And if you think that works together for the long term, I think either path, there's logic behind. You can tell me there's a logical stance behind either one of them. It's just for their vision of what they want to be as a football team going forward. I think that's a pretty massive decision that they need to make, of whether they want to commit to DK Metcalf longer than the 6 years he's already been here and the 1 more year left on his contract.
Yeah, it's amazing. I think when you poll most Seahawks fans, Curtis, and go on, answer this one first. When you poll most Seahawks fans, I wonder what they would say about the tenure of DK Metcalf. Massive success, a success, average, a little disappointing. Because how do you think that they would answer that? His numbers would back up. I mean, there was something they flashed. It was either the last game or maybe it was during the wild card weekends. He's one of the only wide receivers in the first 6 years of his careers that I think it was a certain amount of yards in touchdowns or receptions. I mean, he's and you touched on it. You based on his stats, what he's compared to some of these other guys. He's been in the upper echelon. He hasn't had these massive, like, just dominating seasons, but in the course of his career to start, he's very comparable to many. How do you think fans would answer that, though, that question?
I'm not sure. And one thing I want to add to it is that I've always found it interesting because I don't know that a wide receiver necessarily has been like the thing that's gotten you a Super Bowl either. Like, there's Justin Jefferson hasn't been able to get there. Calvin Johnson never did. You go through the lengths of really good receivers in the NFL, and the closest I can think of to carrying their team to a Super Bowl in recent memory was Julio Jones, and they, were able to fell short in the Atlanta Super Bowl against New England. I think that was one of those types of seasons, and so you have to have good receivers, don't get me wrong, but does the true number one guy carry you to the Super Bowl in quite the same way? I don't know that they do. When it comes to DK's first, 6 years, I don't know that fans necessarily understand just how good DK Metcalf has been with the Seahawks over his first 6 seasons. The numbers are absolutely there for the long term. So are the number of penalties that people are going to have stick in the back of their mind that, personal fouls and unsportsmanlike conducts and stuff that are going to come to mind every time the next one of those happens. So it's interesting what the conversation is with DK because, purely on what he's done, there's no reason you wouldn't think that an extension for him would be wholly appropriate and necessary. And I could still, like I said, you could convince me that if you want to use that $30+ million a year in cap space in a different way and sign another receiver or two in the draft, commit to Jackson Smith and Jigba as your receiver you're going to pay for the long term. I think there's a logic behind that path as well. So, it'll be really curious to see how that kind of falls. But DK has been super productive through his 6 years and wholly deserves the credit for the player he's been.
Tim, he's got me going down a rabbit hole right now. I'm so distracted. I'm looking at past Super Bowl champions, and Curtis, to his point, Tim, he's right. Like I'm now to the Tampa Bay, Super Bowl over Kansas City, which they won 31-9. Again, no dominant wide receiver. Unless, hold on, let me backtrack with Kansas City last 2 years. Are we considering Kelsey a dominant wide receiver? I mean, obviously he's a tight end, so we have to take him out of it.
Yeah.
Cooper Kupp.
Not anywhere near the top of the tight end, the receiver pay scale. So
no, you're
I
right.
Consider him the same way.
Cooper Kupp, no, we don't. Not in terms of money, right?
No, and at that point of his career, he was still relatively early in his career. I mean, it's an interesting conversation. So we all have text threads, right? We all have our threads with our friends and whatever. And so take this with a grain of salt because these are a bunch of dumbasses that I grew up with in Ellensburg. But so they're not really highly educated, and I really hope they all see this. And
This is a shot at people from Ellensburg, and I'm not from there, and I don't want to stand for it. I don't like.
And I am, so I'm allowed to say it. But so I have this one text thread that I have to actually mute during Seahawks games because all these guys talk about during the game is what's happening. But if you were to poll these 7 people, you would think DK Metcalf is the worst selection the Seahawks have ever made. that he has completely failed to live up to the standard that everyone expected for him when he was taken as a late second round pick by the Seahawks in 2019. He is, I don't want to use the term polarizing, but to me, he has as wide of a variance of reactions from fans that I can remember seeing from a guy who, objectively standing back from it in my perspective, I think has been one of the better players that they have had on their roster for the last, 6 years now? Yeah. It's to the point that you made about the stat. I think it was 900 yards and I think 6 touchdowns in his first 6 seasons, and Randy Moss is the only other one.
That's right.
So you're putting him in company with a guy who's a Hall of Famer, and that's whether you view DK's career as eventually having that kind of trajectory. What he's done his first 6 years is equivalent to what Randy Moss did. So take that for what it is. I think in general, the way that probably Curtis and I and you, Puck, view it is that he has been one of the great stories that they've had over the last 6 years, that he has produced at a level that is among the better receivers in the league, not elite, but among the better receivers in the league. But if you were to ask fans, I think a lot of fans would probably say he hasn't lived up to the hopes, maybe not the expectations, but the hopes of what he could be for this team.
I think here's how I'd answer this, Curtis. I would say he's been very good. I don't think he's been great. And I don't know if that's a fault of his or it's the offense that's been called for him, the quarterback play. I don't know. I guess here's how I would say this, and then I'll shut up. I look at him, and he gets off the bus. He's in warm-ups, and I say to myself, how does anyone defend this guy? How does anyone do it? Why is he not dominant in the red zone like future Hall of Famer Mike Evans? He's bigger than Mike Evans. He's more athletic than Mike Evans. He's everything. And I think so. I don't think he is, based on the physical attributes that he brings to the field. I'm not sure he's reached what I thought he was going to reach as a player.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that I don't think he's like the dominant number one, receiver in the NFL. Like, kind of like the quarterback discussion where there might be four of that top tier of quarterback guys. I don't know that DK is in the elite tier of 5 or 6 wide receivers that, would probably make up that group, but he's pretty close to it. He's, trailing a step behind it or so. And the production has certainly been there on the aggregate over 6 seasons to say that he's been very, very good. As Tim mentioned, a second round draft pick. This is not somebody you're taking round 1, third pick overall, and expecting to have the career that he's had. He's wholly outpaced his production for the draft spot he was in for sure. You wholly take that and run with it. And he's been terrific for them in that regard. And you could still look at it and say, there's probably more there that you could have gotten out of him through these 6 years too, to where maybe he is closer to that top elite tier wide receiver conversation than I think he currently is.
Yeah, it's I have got, as you guys are talking, I'm just going back through the Super Bowls, just looking at box scores and wide receivers. We mentioned Mike Evans. I can go probably to Mike Evans, and he's still not one of the highest paid wide receivers in the league, not even close. But Mike Evans would be the one, I guess, true like dominant number one wide receiver that I think if we all were having a discussion, that has won a Super Bowl back in 21. I mean, you start going through some of these box scores, and you're just like, and you don't see these guys that are the highest paid at the wide receiver position. You just don't. And Curtis, you brought this up earlier. If you are now wanting to transition again, right, and this is kind of old, again, it's like a Pete Carroll offense. If you want to get back to hard-nosed football and running the ball, does it make sense to sit there and tie up so much money in DK Metcalf, and then eventually you're going to have to do the same thing here with Jackson Smith and Jigba coming up very soon?
Yeah, that's the discussion, and why I think it's a real question that they need to answer for themselves. Because you could wholly, completely say that, yeah, you pay DK Metcalf, we commit to that, but then you might need to make a decision with Jackson in a couple years, because having 2 receivers making that kind of money on a team where you can't build an offensive line and can't run the football the way you want to is, potentially problematic from a contract standpoint. So that's the pickle you might find yourself being in if you get, a couple more years down the road here and trying to make that all work for the long term.
Because I just want to make sure I read the contract. He's signed Jameson next season in 26, but heading into 26 is when that's when they're going to sit there and want to negotiate a new deal for him.
Well, and as a first round pick, he'll have that 5th-year option available too. So that pushes it out an extra year from the rest of a draft class.
So 28 is when he's a true free agent.
Yeah, but that conversation does come down the road. And Tim, it's after the first 3 years you become eligible for a contract extension, right?
Yes.
So that's you can't talk extension until you're 3 years in, and so after next season, then you're going to be up to that point for Jackson.
Yeah. So after next season, they can start talking contract extension for him.
Correct.
Yeah. Because of the 5th-year option, they have some leverage, and you probably don't have to right away, but it's coming.
Well, and Tim, one thing at least I've noticed in watching, we all watch it. We watch college football, and then these guys who play wide receiver in college come to the NFL. It seems like more than ever that these guys are plug and play like right away. That it's become almost in a way you take them in the first round opposed to running backs, but almost like the running back situation where you find guys and it's like Moneyball now with some of these wide receivers, like how we've done it with running backs.
Yeah, Curtis brought this up I think last week. Like you can go find a good wide receiver in the third round. Like that's not a hard thing to find anymore with the way college offenses have become and the skills that those guys are bringing in, right away to be. I mean, Jesus, Puka Nacua is the greatest, recent example of a guy who he was a 5th rounder or 6th rounder, whenever he was taken. Like these guys are as we talk about the advancement of guys being ready for the pros, whether it's the NBA, whether it's Major League Baseball, the guys that are fast tracked through the farm system and able to come up and play at 19, 20, 21. Think of Julio, think of Jackson Merrill, think of those kind of guys. The NFL, it's wide receivers now. Like that's the position that has become as plug and play as you can find. Maybe defensive back a little bit too. But a lot of times, like elite pass rushers, they need a little bit of time to develop. Interior defensive linemen, like Byron Murphy was great this year. I think he's going to be really good in a couple of years. Offensive line, we've seen the issues there. It's kind of rare to find a guy who's immediately ready to come in and handle a position like left tackle or center or whatever immediately coming out of college. You can find those, but those are guys who end up becoming all pros. Wide receiver and running back, you can throw them in there and they can do the job. Mm-hmm. And so it kind of back to what Curtis was saying. Do you pay $30+ million a year for a guy who, one, might not fit perfectly in the offensive system that you want to take going forward? And that's where the offensive coordinator conversation, I think, really comes into play is who's your OC going to be? What's their philosophy? How does that mesh with what Mike McDonald wants? And where's the priority of a receiver there? And then two, do you want to pay $30+ million for a guy who's probably not your number one option,
right,
moving forward? A guy who definitely took us, became your number two this year because Jackson Smith and Jake became your clear number one guy, and the connection that he had with Geno Smith. So, does DK being on the field probably make them a better team? Yes. Does he make them a better team at $32-33 million a year when those resources can be used elsewhere? And maybe you can find a guy maybe you can find Kyle Williams, for example, in the 5th or 6th round, and sure, he comes in and can be that guy. It's a really interesting cost benefit analysis that they have with him for this offseason.
Yeah, and again, I'm going to sit here and I'm no Rob Rang, okay? And I don't know the exact health and how the NFL views the wide receiver class. I would say this, just based on an idiot that sits here and watches college football on Saturdays, and I'm looking at one ranking here that has, you brought him up. I was going to use a different player, but I'm going to use Kyle Williams as an example. And this list has Kyle Williams ranked as the 34th best wide receiver. If that's the 34th best wide receiver, then I would say it's probably a good wide receiver class. Because the other guy I was thinking about, they have, I don't know if you've seen him play, Nick Nash from San Jose State. He's ranked 25th according to the site. If he's 25th, then I would venture to say that it's probably a good class. Now, again, I watched Nick Nash twice. One of them was against the Cougs, and their secondary is terrible. So maybe that had something to do with it. But Nick Nash looks like, when you see him, he looks like an NFL wide receiver. Yeah, I think, Tim, to your point, I mean, you can the amount of money you could save to fix a glaring problem on this football team, in which it's almost they have gone away from what made them successful early on, and what made them successful early on was strong lines, strong defensive line, strong offensive line. And if you can allocate those resources, Tim, right back to that offensive line, it's almost like if you give the quarterback more time to throw the football, the wide receivers are good enough to get open and maybe not as dynamic as someone like DK. And then the running game starts, playing better. I mean, that's the one thing that I took away from these wild card games this weekend, is watching some of these teams play, and their offensive line plays just night and day when I watched Seattle throughout their week in and week out.
Well, think about the Ravens running the ball. Think about the Eagles running the ball. Obviously, they have elite running backs, but they have elite offensive lines. I mean, and that's even Buffalo, what they did against Denver with James Cook. Like you have to be, if nothing else, we've seen the value of having a above average offensive line. It's likely going to get you to the playoffs if you have competent skill position players around them. And then when you get to the postseason, this weekend was as good of an example as any of how important being able to run the ball in January and February truly is.
Yeah, because Curtis, look at it. I mean, we'll see a true number one tonight in Jefferson. But what about these other games this past weekend, right? What's the other true number one wide receiver in terms of a team that won or lost? I mean, A.J. Brown, and he had 3 targets and 1 catch?
AJ is one of those receivers making north of 30 a year, and he's been, very, very good. Did he win that game for them this weekend? No. It's an interesting cost benefit analysis to kind of go about. Now, DK Metcalf would have helped the Chargers out quite a bit, though their offensive line played as equally bad as about the Seahawks had for chunks of the season as well. So that there would be teams out there that would certainly be interested in DK Metcalf if you made him available. So,
but let me jump in.
I do think it's interesting. Yeah,
look at the Bills, who are going to be one of the favorites to win the Super Bowl, right? Look at their wide receivers yesterday. Curtis Samuel, 3 catches, 68 yards. Khalil Shakir, 6 catches, 61, and then they got 2 tight ends in Kincaid and Knox.
They got rid of Stephon Diggs.
Yeah.
Who had been that guy for them for a while. They never got there with him on the roster.
Mm-hmm. I mean, you go with the Commanders yesterday. I mean, the Commanders, their leading wide receiver, they got Terry McLaurin yesterday and Diami Brown. I mean, I'll be honest with you, I never heard of that guy.
Yeah. No, I think it's what this weekend showed, and maybe this will be disproven next weekend in the divisional weekend. But if you have one guy, Terry McLaurin is the perfect example. If you have one guy that can go win off the line of scrimmage and get you a contested catch, and then you can fill in the rest with guys that you've never even heard of, and you can be successful. Now, they have a quarterback who does a whole bunch of stuff that is really, really special, and that guy's looks like he's going to be a stud. But to your point, like if you have one guy, one stud at receiver, you can kind of make it work. And that's kind of the philosophical question Seattle has to answer. Do you want to have 2, or do you feel comfortable with 1?
Because you look, it's kind of like the Lions example, right? Almont St. Brown makes a ton of money. Now, Jameson Williams does not yet.
Yes.
Now, he will eventually.
Probably can't with them for the long term. Yeah. I would think, and I would, pause it. That's the question you're going to have to answer.
But don't they make a decision eventually what they want to do? They'll have to choose.
Yeah, probably. I would think so. It's 1 year they're going to have to make a choice on at some point too.
But the reason they're successful and the reason they're going to be in a position to win the whole thing is because their offensive line and then their running backs. I mean, it starts there.
The receivers are certainly part of that conversation, but yeah, it's not like they have the one dominant receiver the Calvin Johnson era of the Detroit. It's not that. It's not a good quarterback, one receiver, and try to make it work elsewhere. And of course, they never could because they were incompetent as hell throughout those years. But yeah, I just in general, like I said earlier, it's tough to find that one game-changing receiver that pushes a team to the Super Bowl, wins the Super Bowl because of that guy. And like I said, I think it was probably that Julio Jones possibility where they were leading 28-3 in the second half of the Super Bowl could have closed it out. It's the closest to that conversation I think you can probably get.
And Tim, they have no further evidence for that outlook on having a stud wide receiver or just having some, I want to say just some guys, but certainly not true number one wide receivers. I mean, they experienced it themselves. It was in their own backyard. That's how they won a Super Bowl. I mean, that's how they got to back-to-back Super Bowls. I mean, my God, you sometimes forget in that second Super Bowl in which they lost to New England, their leading wide receiver that night was Chris Matthews.
I will never forget that because I was writing a Chris Matthews Super Bowl MVP story I was in the
right.
Yeah, I mean, maybe Jermaine would have got it because of the catch, or if Marshawn gets in, then maybe he's the Super Bowl MVP. But yeah, you saw the ability to win at the highest level with what was their thing? They hated being called pedestrians.
Yeah, pedestrians.
The Golden Tate and Doug Baldwin and Percy Harvin, Jermaine.
But collectively as a trio, they were so good.
Yeah, they were. They fit their roles incredibly well, but none of them were ever going to be quote unquote number one star receivers. And again, we bring this all the way back to DK. Like that's the question. Like how do you make this work from a complementary standpoint to improve a team that desperately needs help in one specific position group? Does that mean paying the wide receiver $35 million? I don't know. I really don't know. And part of it too is the free agent class for wide receivers this year, outside of T. Higgins, it's not great. It's T. Higgins is going to get paid. He's 100% going to get paid. Stephon Diggs probably going to get paid. Chris Goodwin's coming off an injury and he's been around for a while. Amari Cooper, I don't know, man. Like he's been sort of nothing, and I had him on my fantasy team this year, so I know he's been sort of nothing. DeAndre Hopkins, Hollywood Brown, Keenan Allen. Like, I'm not saying they should trade DK, but if there was ever a year because of what the free agent class looks like that maybe you could actually get some value for him on the trade market, I don't know. Maybe this could be the year. Look, I'm not advocating one way or the other about what they should do. I'm just saying, like, what you think your philosophy needs to be to win moving forward is sort of determined by what you do with wide receiver this offseason.
Absolutely.
So,
all right, there they are.
And
go ahead, Curtis.
That's the point I was making out of the DK conversation, because I think, like I said, I think either path you choose, there's validity to it, and you can head down either path. But that's going to change where you're going with your franchise and the team over the next couple of years based off of what you do with that decision.
Yeah, absolutely. Tim Booth, Seattle Times. Go check all his work there, seattletimes.com. Curtis Crabtree, Fox 13, covering all things Seahawks and everything for you, the sports devouring public. They do it all. One-stop shop. They're a weekly conversation with us, brought to you by Georgetown Brewery. Go visit georgetownbeer.com. When you're down there at the brewery, go check out the new Tavern Beer domestic style lager. Go ask your local bar if they don't have it on tap, to put on the Tavern Beer. It is a wonderful. Go check it out at georgetownbeer.com. All right, next week we'll put under the microscope the offensive line. That's always fun. Who doesn't like talking about offensive line for the past 10 years? So we'll do it next week. This episode of Ground Puck Seahawks podcast will be up on YouTube. When you're there, please subscribe there. Also, check it out on Apple, Spotify, wherever you find your podcasts. Of course, always up at pucksports.com. Gentlemen, we'll talk to you next week. Have a good one.
Thanks, Puck. See ya.
Thanks, Puck. See ya.